What happens when the most powerful families on Earth lose control of their minds or their health? When kings and queens descend into madness, or are struck by mysterious illness, who decides what happens next? Across centuries, royal courts devised quiet methods to manage the unmanageable, from secret seclusions to forced treatments. In this video we explore how illness and madness were handled behind palace walls. Take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these deep history videos coming. In the courts of Europe and beyond, when a king or queen became ill, especially in the mind, there was no such thing as privacy, and yet everything was hidden. Mental illness in royal families posed a unique danger, not just to the individual, but to dynasties, empires, national stability. A monarch's authority rested on the appearance of control, of divine favor, and of rational judgment. To appear weak, confused, unstable, was to invite rebellion, rival claims, even foreign intervention. That's why, across history, madness in the royal bloodline was often met with silence or concealment. Sometimes the afflicted royal would vanish from public life, with vague explanations offered to the people, traveling abroad for health, suffering from overwork, mourning a private loss. In truth, they might be confined to a wing of a palace, a country estate, or even an asylum, under constant supervision. King George III of Britain famously suffered repeated bouts of what was then described as madness, likely now considered a form of bipolar disorder or porphyria. During his worst episodes, he was isolated from his family, his speech rambling, his behavior erratic. The court responded with a Regency Act, placing his son in charge of royal duties, without ever formally removing the king. This kind of legal fiction preserved the monarchy's continuity, while shielding the sovereign's condition. It wasn't just the British. In Spain, King Carlos II, the last Habsburg ruler, was plagued by physical and mental frailty, so severe that many blamed sorcery or divine punishment. His deformities, seizures, and cognitive issues were described in hushed tones, and courtiers fought fiercely over who could control the royal environment. In France, the brother of King Louis Philippe, Duke of Orléans, was known to have violent mood swings and erratic behavior, often explained away as eccentricity, or the result of courtly excess. The term madness was fluid, broadly applied to many behaviors, from hallucinations and delusions, to melancholia and rage. But royals were not always removed from power. Sometimes their illness was used against them, strategically, to justify changes in succession, or to place a regent in control. In the Ottoman Empire, sultans with suspected instability were often deposed by palace factions, sometimes assassinated. In the name of protecting the state, mental illness could be both weapon and shield, depending on who held influence at court. Royal physicians were central to these decisions. They examined the monarch, issued discreet reports, and carefully chose their words. A diagnosis of melancholy or nervous weakness was more acceptable than madness, which could end a reign. The physicians themselves were often torn between medical knowledge and political loyalty. Their tools were limited. Treatments included purging, leeches, herbal tonics, and rest cures. In some courts, physical restraints were used in extreme cases, but these were hidden from view. It was also common for royal patients to be attended by religious figures, priests, confessors, or spiritual advisors, who framed their suffering in moral or divine terms. Some believed that illness of the mind was punishment for sin, or a test of faith. Others turned to astrology, drawing up birth charts, searching for cosmic explanations for the sovereign's behavior. The public, meanwhile, was often kept in the dark. When rumors leaked, they were quickly countered, with displays of the monarch at formal events, waving from balconies, or issuing proclamations in their name. But these displays could be faked. ghost-written declarations, appearances staged from afar, or substitutes used in paintings and parades. When concealment failed, a narrative was crafted, emphasizing the monarch's humanity, the burden of rule, or the cruelty of fate. Yet behind closed doors, families suffered, and advisors maneuvered. The royal household often became divided between those who sought to protect the ill and those who sought to replace them. Records from these periods are sparse and coded. Phrases like withdrawn from affairs or in need of rest mask deeper realities. Madness in the royal line also raised fears about heredity. If one monarch was unstable, would their children inherit the same traits? This fear shaped marriages, alliances, and even eugenic thinking in some circles. Some royal children, with signs of mental illness, were quietly removed from succession, or placed under lifelong guardianship. The goal was always the same: to preserve the illusion of stability, of divine order, of royal strength, because to admit otherwise was to admit vulnerability, and in the eyes of empire, vulnerability was unacceptable. The treatment of illness and madness in royal families was not just medical, it was political, religious, and deeply secretive. The palace became a place of masks, not only of power, but of control over reality itself, and the people at the center, those who suffered, often disappeared from view. Long before their reign was declared at an end, the practice of assigning royal physicians was not just a matter of health, it was a matter of rank, of loyalty, and of secrecy. Royal doctors were not ordinary practitioners. They were selected for discretion as much as for their training, often sworn to silence, and granted access to the sovereign's most private conditions. In early modern Europe, most royal physicians came from elite academic backgrounds, trained in universities like Padua, Paris, or Leiden, with a curriculum rooted in Galenic theory, the balance of humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. This system guided treatments for both body and mind. If the king was angry or paranoid, he might be said to have an excess of yellow bile. If he was withdrawn or melancholic, too much black bile might be blamed. Cures followed this logic: bleeding to reduce heat, vomiting to purge impurities, herbs to cool or warm the temperament, and dietary restrictions to balance internal flows. But the outcomes were uncertain, and in many cases, these methods failed to ease suffering or worsened the condition. Physicians still persisted, in part because they were also symbols. Their presence suggested order, a system of care, and royal dignity in the face of illness. In some cases, a team of physicians would be appointed, each with a specific role: one to observe behavior, one to manage sleep and diet, another to recommend spiritual remedies. This team approach mirrored the hierarchy of court: layers of responsibility, and buffers between the monarch and public scrutiny. Medical records were rarely kept, and when they were, they used euphemisms, phrases like disturbance of the spirit's nervous complaint, or wandering imagination. In the court of the Habsburgs, notices were often deliberately vague, referring to the monarch's delicate constitution, or need for tranquility. These descriptions served political ends, to maintain legitimacy, and to delay any formal moves toward regency or deposition. But physicians weren't the only caregivers. In many royal households, especially in France and Russia, the queen or female relatives played a large part in overseeing the ill. They arranged routines, ensured the patient was not humiliated, and sometimes fought with ministers to delay political action against the sovereign. In Russia, Tsar Paul I, once prescribed by foreign envoys as unstable, his erratic orders and obsession with protocol worried his advisors and foreign allies alike, but his wife Maria Feodorovna acted as both consort and buffer, softening his decrees, managing court functions, and maintaining appearances for as long as she could. Eventually, Paul was assassinated in a palace coup and replaced by his son. The illness of a royal figure often had consequences far beyond medicine. It influenced diplomacy, court appointments, and the movements of armies. This made the physician's position even more precarious. A diagnosis could shift the balance of power, could lead to removal from office, or elevation if the advice pleased the court faction in power. Some royal doctors became famous, like François Quesnay of France, who served Louis XV and became an early voice in economic theory as well. Others faded into history, but their influence was undeniable. In many cases, the act of declaring a royal patient mad was itself a political move. A doctor's report could trigger a regency act, change succession, or legitimize a usurper's claim. In the Holy Roman Empire, when Emperor Ferdinand I's mental capacity was questioned, the court carefully orchestrated a slow transfer of responsibilities, using medical reports to justify a shift without causing alarm. Even in the 19th century, the process remained opaque. Ludwig II of Bavaria, known for his grand castles and solitary behavior, was declared insane by a panel of physicians, never directly examined him. The declaration, pushed by ministers, allowed his uncle to assume the throne. Ludwig was taken into custody and died days later under mysterious circumstances. This pattern of medicine serving power was not isolated. It repeated. In case after case, mental illness in royalty was never treated purely as a medical issue. It was interpreted, managed, and often manipulated through the lens of court politics. Behind every royal diagnosis stood advisors, doctors, and family members, weighing not only symptoms, but consequences. And in the end, what passed for treatment was often less about healing and more about control of the royal body and the royal image, both carefully maintained, even when the mind was slipping beyond reach. When a royal figure showed signs of illness, especially mental disturbance, the response from court was not uniform. It varied, depending on culture, religion, and time period. But one thing remained constant: a need to control the narrative. Public image was crucial. The monarch represented not just a person, but an institution, a dynasty, and often the will of God. To appear sick, or confused, or out of touch with reality, risked more than personal embarrassment. It threatened the legitimacy of the entire ruling system. In many monarchies, illness was recast as something else: a temporary fatigue, a spiritual burden, a sign of deeper wisdom or sensitivity. If the sovereign's behavior was erratic, it might be blamed on exhaustion, on grief, or even divine ecstasy. By shaping public perception, courts could delay the moment of crisis, buying time to groom a successor, or to build a consensus for change. King Charles VI of France, nicknamed Charles the Mad, suffered periodic delusions, sometimes failing to recognize his own family, or believing he was made of glass. His episodes were well known, and yet, the French court continued to operate in his name, issuing edicts, negotiating treaties, as if the king were of sound mind. The real power shifted quietly to his wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, and to rival factions, each claiming to protect the realm in the monarch's best interest. This dual reality, a king nominally in charge, but practically sidelined, became common in cases of royal illness. In England, a similar situation unfolded with King Henry VI, whose catatonic episodes and passivity led to the rise of a Duke of York, and eventually, the Wars of the Roses. As illness progressed, so did rumors. In the absence of clear information, court gossip filled the void. Speculation became dangerous, as different nobles interpreted the sovereign's behavior to suit their ambitions. This often led to purges, arrests, or reshuffling of court offices, especially when a monarch's health seemed to be declining. Even small signs, such as failing to attend council, or repeating a phrase too often, could trigger suspicion. Letters from ambassadors provide detailed accounts of kings and queens behaving strangely, or being shielded from view. In Spain, ambassadors wrote home about the Habsburgs, noting their physical deformities, their speech difficulties, and their inability to produce heirs. This fueled perceptions of a doomed bloodline, and influenced international diplomacy, as other courts judged whether to ally with or distance themselves from such families. For women, the standards were different. A queen consort could fall ill, but was rarely seen as a direct threat. Her condition might be pitied or romanticized, especially if it did not interfere with childbearing. But if a reigning queen showed mental instability, such as Queen Juana of Castile, the reaction was swift and harsh. Juana, later known as Juana la Loca, was declared unfit to rule. Her husband and then her son took control of the kingdom. She spent decades confined in a convent-like palace in Tordesillas. Her alleged madness may have been exaggerated or exploited to remove her from power. Similar tactics were used in other courts, where illness became the pretext for political realignment. In Russia, Peter III was deposed by his wife, Catherine the Great. Part of the justification included suggestions that he was unstable, immature, incapable of ruling a vast empire. Though these claims were never medically confirmed, they were effective, and Peter was quietly eliminated within days of his abdication. Even into the 19th century, the pattern held. When Queen Maria I of Portugal suffered a nervous breakdown and began experiencing hallucinations and screaming fits, her son João was named Prince Regent. Despite her long reign, Maria lived the rest of her life in seclusion, rarely seen, rarely mentioned, still technically queen, but erased from public life. This erasure was often physical. Royal palaces were large enough to hide an ailing monarch in a distant wing, servants sworn to silence, access tightly controlled. Visitors might be told the monarch was resting or conducting private business, when in fact they were incapacitated. Meanwhile, public rituals continued, feasts, proclamations, and ceremonies, all carried out in the monarch's name. The illusion was maintained at all costs, and if the condition worsened, a carefully worded statement might be issued, expressing concern, but offering no specifics. In some courts, the role of spiritual advisors became more pronounced. The monarch was urged to pray, to confess, to seek redemption. Some interpreted mental illness as the result of moral failing, a punishment for pride, or an opportunity for purification. This belief persisted well into the Age of Enlightenment, coexisting with medical theories, and sometimes clashing with them. Whether handled by doctors, priests, or ministers, the treatment of royal illness was shaped by one priority above all: preserve the throne, preserve the image, preserve the order of succession. The sovereign's health was never just their own concern, it was a matter of state, and sometimes a state secret. Religious interpretation of illness was one of the oldest and most persistent frameworks used to understand royal suffering. Long before the rise of modern medicine, sickness of the body or mind was seen through the lens of divine will. In Christian monarchies, illness could be viewed as a test of faith, a punishment for sin, or a sign of spiritual elevation. The monarch, seen as chosen by God, was expected to reflect divine favor. If that favor appeared withdrawn, people searched for moral or spiritual causes. Confessors and court chaplains played major roles in diagnosing the soul. They questioned the sovereign's conscience, his sins, doubts, and devotion. If the king became melancholy, he might be urged to fast, to confess, to do penance. In some cases, royal illness led to changes in policy, charitable donations, pilgrimages, or religious reforms. When King Louis the Runk of France fell ill during the Crusades, his suffering was interpreted as divine correction, and after recovery, he intensified his religious piety, earning later sainthood. Other monarchs took vows, in moments of illness, promising to build churches or sponsor monasteries. If restored to health, these acts were not just private devotion, they had political value, reinforcing the idea of a ruler in harmony with heaven, and of a kingdom under divine watch. In Catholic countries, royals often receive the last rites, even for non-fatal illnesses, just in case, and to purify the soul. But religious thinking also had its dark side. Mental illness was sometimes seen as possession, a sign that the monarch had opened themselves to evil through pride, lust, or heresy. This interpretation could justify harsh measures, isolation, exorcisms, or increased clerical control. In Spain, especially under the influence of the Inquisition, any irregular behavior was watched closely. Monarchs who strayed from orthodoxy, or who questioned doctrine during illness, risked being labeled spiritually compromised. In Protestant courts, the same patterns emerged, but with different language. Instead of demons, terms like God's discipline or inner struggle were used. The idea of the monarch as a moral example remained strong. If the ruler suffered, the nation prayed, fast days were declared, special sermons delivered, calling on the people to repent and support the sovereign's recovery. Sometimes illness was linked to prophecy, especially in turbulent times. Pamphlets appeared, claiming that the king's sickness foretold judgment, or that his madness was a sign of apocalypse. Such texts were often banned, but they spread nonetheless, undermining royal authority and stirring fear or rebellion. The link between sin and suffering extended to the royal family as a whole. If a dynasty had repeated health problems, some saw it as divine disfavor, perhaps due to an ancestor's crime, or to corruption in court life. These interpretations added pressure on the monarch and their household to behave devoutly, to sponsor churches, to appear humble and obedient to God. In Orthodox countries, like Russia and Byzantium, similar patterns existed. The Tsar was seen as God's anointed. Any deviation in his mind or body was interpreted through scripture and tradition. Icons were brought in, holy relics touched to the sick, monks summoned to pray continuously, day and night. In times of crisis, these rituals intensified. The palace might become more like a monastery, quiet, slow, prayerful. At the same time, political factions used religion as a tool. If a rival wanted to discredit the monarch, they might suggest he had fallen from grace, and that God was withdrawing his blessing. This opened the door for regents, for abdication, or even revolt. Religious symbols and services became stages for political messaging. The king's presence at Mass, or absence from it, could signal health or instability. Royal chapels became theaters of reassurance, showing the king kneeling, receiving communion, appearing calm. Even when behind the scenes, his condition was deteriorating. In some monarchies, illness sparked religious reform. An ailing king might sponsor new holy orders, ban certain court entertainments, or tighten religious laws. In doing so, he showed contrition and sought to reclaim divine favor. Thus illness reshaped policy, and not only behind closed doors. As medical science advanced, the role of religion declined, but never disappeared entirely. Even in the 19th century, prayers for the monarch's health were common in churches, and religious figures remained at the bedside. Their role was more ceremonial, but still meaningful, for the court and for the people, because the idea that the king's body reflected divine order was deeply rooted and slow to fade. In times of royal illness, people did not just wait for the doctor's word. They watched the skies. They lit candles, They prayed, and they hoped that the balance between heaven and throne would be restored once more. Among the oldest methods used in royal medicine were herbal treatments, folk remedies, and natural preparations, long before the emergence of modern pharmaceuticals, and often continuing alongside formal medical advice. In many royal courts, the royal apothecary held a respected position, charged with preparing herbal infusions, ointments, tinctures, powders and teas. The apothecary worked closely with court physicians, and often with members of the royal household, especially queens and governesses, who maintained private herb gardens. These gardens were not just ornamental. They supplied ingredients believed to calm the mind, strengthen the body, and restore humoral balance. Common ingredients included lavender, for sleep and agitation, chamomile, for digestion and nerves, valerian root, for hysteria and trembling, rosemary was used for memory, sage for melancholy, and wormwood for mental confusion. Infusions were prepared fresh, sometimes boiled into syrups, or soaked in wine and spirits, for easier ingestion. In cases of fever or delirium, cold compresses were applied, made from mint, violets, or elderflower, to reduce heat and soothe the senses. For nightmares or hallucinations, sachets of calming herbs were placed beneath pillows or burned as incense during prayer. Some remedies had religious associations: holy thistle, Our Lady's bedstraw, St. John's wort. These plants were used not only for healing, but for spiritual protection, especially in times when mental illness was seen as a threat to the soul. Recipes were passed down, not just through physicians, but through royal women, who often acted as informal healers within the palace walls. In Tudor England, Queen Elizabeth I was known to favor herbal infusions, and had a personal herb garden tended at Hampton Court. Catherine de' Medici of France traveled with her own apothecaries, and brought with her a collection of Italian remedies that were blended with French traditions. In Russia, royal remedies often combined herbs with elements from Orthodox religious ritual, including the use of blessed water and prayers spoken over ingredients. In China's imperial courts, the emperor's physicians used traditional formulas based on centuries of recorded knowledge, including ginseng, reishi mushrooms, and licorice root, combined with acupuncture and moxibustion. Even in Europe, some physicians studied Chinese, Persian, or Arabic texts, adapting foreign herbal wisdom into local practice. But not all remedies were gentle. Some preparations included heavy metals, such as mercury or antimony, used to purge the body, but with toxic effects over time. Laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, became common in the 17th and 18th centuries, administered to calm nerves, ease pain, or induce sleep. It was used for monarchs suffering from insomnia or from deep melancholy, but it often led to dependence and worsened confusion or lethargy. Royal children were sometimes treated with honeyed concoctions to mask bitterness, or with dried fruit pastes infused with calming herbs. In times of plague or widespread illness, royal herbal preparations expanded in scale. Sachets worn around the neck, washes and steams made from rosemary and vinegar, believed to ward off contagion. In the treatment of madness, herbalism offered both physical and symbolic relief. Madness was often linked with imbalance, heat, dryness, or excess wind in the body. Cooling herbs like lettuce, cucumber and barley were prescribed along with warm poultices, applied to the chest or forehead. Some treatments involved bathing in infusions of herbs to cleanse the skin and calm the nerves. Others involved fasting, combined with simple broths made from boiled greens and light roots. The goal was always balance, not just of body, but of spirit and temperament. Despite the rise of chemical medicine, herbal traditions remained strong, often coexisting with more aggressive treatments. such as bloodletting or cauterization. Herbs offered what invasive methods did not: a sense of care, of continuity, and connection to nature. And in royal courts, where everything was symbolic, a potion made from sacred plants, or gathered on a feast day, held more meaning than a mere pill. Herbalism also offered privacy, unlike formal diagnoses, which required court acknowledgement. An herbal remedy could be quietly administered by a trusted servant, a nursemaid, or a member of the royal family. It allowed the illness, especially of the mind, to be treated without public discussion. Some royal households kept detailed herbal manuals, written in private code, to record what worked and what didn't. Others consulted wise women, midwives, or unofficial healers, especially in rural estates. Far from the capital, these women brought with them knowledge passed down orally, blending folklore and observation, to treat symptoms quietly. In the end, herbal remedies provided not just treatment, but comfort. In rooms darkened for rest, windows open to cool air, candles lit at nightfall, a cup of herbal infusion offered the monarch a rare moment of peace. Even if only temporary, even if only symbolic, it was something to hold on to in the quiet battle between crown and affliction. In some royal courts, illness became the reason for constructing entire buildings, or designating specific retreats, intended solely for rest, recovery, or seclusion. These places varied from garden lodges and hunting estates to full-scale hospitals, funded and maintained by royal budgets. The goal was not just healing, but discretion. A king suffering from delirium, a queen with chronic melancholy, a prince who could no longer speak clearly, could be moved away from the capital, away from the eyes of ambassadors, and away from court intrigue. One example was Kew Palace in England, used during King George III's episodes of mental illness, a quiet royal residence near London, where the king could be treated and guarded by physicians and a small loyal staff. There his condition could be monitored, his movements controlled, and his appearance kept from the public. These retreats allowed for tailored care, including open grounds for walking, gardens planted for medicinal use, and rooms configured to reduce noise and light. Inside, decor was simplified, mirrors removed, clocks silenced to prevent sensory overload. Staff were instructed to speak softly, to avoid sudden gestures, to maintain calm routines. Similar spaces existed elsewhere. In Austria, Emperor Ferdinand IV was eventually moved to Radjany Castle in Prague, where he lived quietly. After abdication, his needs managed by a controlled household, while his brother governed as emperor. In France, when Queen Maria Theresa of Spain suffered from persistent illness, she was taken to Versailles' smaller private wings, away from formal court functions. Some royal residences were built with health in mind from the start. Palaces at high elevations, or near mineral springs, were chosen for their curative air. In Portugal, the Palace of Queluz became a retreat for members of the royal family, with wide corridors and garden paths, intended for daily walks, under physician supervision. In Russia, the Alexander Palace served as a secluded residence for Tsarevich Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia and required constant medical attention. Later, it was also used to isolate Nicholas II and his family during their final months of house arrest. But not all health-related spaces were palaces. In some monarchies, special hospitals were established under royal patronage to care for nobles, clergy, and at times, members of the royal household. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris and the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh served this dual role, as both public hospitals and as sites where royal physicians practiced and trained. In the Ottoman Empire, sections of Topkapi Palace were designated for sick members of the harem, attended by court eunuchs and women healers. Special hams with therapeutic waters were used to calm the nerves and treat physical ailments with steam, massage, and herbal compresses. In the Islamic world, the Bimaristan, a type of hospital, included facilities for mental illness, with music, therapy, recitations of the Quran, and spacious courtyards for rest. In royal contexts, these methods were selectively adopted and blended with local customs. Retreats were also symbolic. A monarch stepping away to focus on health signaled an effort to regain strength rather than surrender power. Statements might be issued, explaining the move as temporary for restoration of vigor or recovery of constitutional balance. Even when treatment lasted years, the official language remained optimistic until death or formal abdication made reality clear. Royal retreats often included chapels for daily prayer, reinforcing the sense of spiritual as well as physical healing. Servants were carefully selected, preferably those without outside loyalties and bound by oath or contract to maintain secrecy. In many cases, patients were discouraged from writing letters or receiving visitors. Their world became narrow, contained a few rooms, a garden path, and the faces of nurses and guards. In return, these retreats offered stability, a controlled environment. Far from the chaos of court, they allowed monarchs to disappear without truly vanishing, to remain sovereign in name, even when unable to act, to give time for succession plans, for alliances to adjust, for history to shift quietly. In later centuries, as medical thinking evolved, some retreats became proto-clinics, with designated rooms for observation, records kept by staff, and notes exchanged between doctors. Still, the atmosphere remained more domestic than clinical. Furniture was familiar, art was religious or pastoral, and rituals of royal life, dress, mealtime, ceremony, continued on a reduced scale. These places were not built for cure, but for containment of illness, of scandal, and of uncertainty, and as long as they remained occupied, they shielded the royal image from exposure, preserving the fiction that the throne was never truly empty, only at rest. For now, among the most common medical practices used in treating illness and madness across royal courts were bloodletting, purging, and other methods based on humoral theory. These practices originated in ancient Greece, especially in the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, and remained dominant in European medicine well into the 18th century. According to humoral theory, the body was made of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness occurred when these were out of balance. A person overly sad or slow was thought to have excess black bile. A person angry or restless, too much yellow bile, blood, was often believed to be in excess, and was frequently the target of treatment. Royal patients, under this framework, were bled regularly, often by leech or lancet. This was done to reduce fever, calm nervous tension, or treat confusion and mania. Bleeding sessions were scheduled, with precise timing, sometimes based on the phases of the moon, or astrological alignments. Veins in the arm, the neck, or behind the ear might be opened. Depending on the symptoms, a disturbed mind might lead to bleeding from the head to release excess heat or pressure. In the French court, bleeding was so common that special basins and cloths were made for the purpose, embroidered with royal insignia. Some monarchs had personal bleeders, trained attendants, who administered the procedure during travel or battle. In addition to bloodletting, purging was a regular treatment. This meant inducing vomiting, or using laxatives, to clear the body of corrupted material. Substances used included rhubarb, root, senna, and calomel, a mercury compound. These substances were potent, and sometimes dangerous, yet they were believed to cleanse the system, restore balance, and improve clarity of thought. For monarchs showing signs of delusion or melancholy, purging was seen as essential to remove the blackness from the gut or brain. Emetics were administered in wine or mixed with fruit juice to mask the taste. Episodes of royal illness often included detailed records of how many ounces of blood were drawn or how many bowel movements followed a purge. These records served both medical and legal functions, proving that care was given and documenting the sovereign's response. Sweating was another method, induced by wrapping the patient in warm blankets, placing them near a hearth, and providing hot herbal teas. The idea was to drive illness outward through the skin, releasing internal toxins. Cupping was also common, using heated glass or horn cups to draw blood to the surface, sometimes breaking the skin to allow for additional bleeding. Royal children were not spared. Infants and young heirs were subjected to similar practices at reduced dosages. In some courts, bleeding began as early as the first signs of fever, believed to prevent convulsions or madness later in life. Queen Anne of Great Britain received frequent purges and bleedings to manage chronic gout, dropsy and melancholy. Though modern scholars believe these treatments may have worsened her condition, but within the medical context of the time, inaction was considered dangerous. To treat was to control. To act was to hope. These procedures also served a symbolic role. To bleed a king was to show that no one, not even the most powerful, was above the laws of nature or of balance. In the Ottoman Empire, sultans underwent ritual bleedings, especially before major fasts or campaigns, a sign of renewal and strength. In China, while bloodletting was rare, other balancing techniques were common, including acupuncture, intended to regulate the flow of qi, the body's internal energy. Though differing in method, the underlying goal was the same: restore harmony, prevent disorder, protect the ruler's function and legacy. Over time, criticism of bloodletting grew. By the late 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers began to question whether such treatments helped or harmed. Yet in many courts, tradition prevailed. Bleeding continued because it was expected, because it had always been done, and because to abandon it felt too risky. Even as new theories emerged, many physicians practiced a hybrid model, blending humoral ideas with observation and emerging chemistry. But for centuries, these acts, bloodletting, purging, sweating, formed the core of royal medical response, a blend of science, belief, and ritual, reinforcing the idea that kings and queens, though anointed and elevated, were still vulnerable, still bodies, still breakable, and that through these rites of medicine, they might be brought back to balance, to clarity, and to rule once more. As mental illness became more visible in royal families, especially during the Enlightenment and early modern period, new frameworks began to emerge, offering alternative explanations and early forms of psychiatric thinking. Royal courts became early testing grounds for evolving ideas about the mind and how it could be treated. Though still deeply influenced by humoral theory, some physicians started to separate mental disturbance from purely physical disease. They began to observe patterns, to distinguish between types of madness, melancholy, mania, hysteria, delusion. These shifts were subtle at first, but accelerated in the 18th century, with the rise of asylums and new medical schools focused on neurology and psychology. In many ways, the royal experience of mental illness shaped public perceptions. When King George's condition became widely known, it sparked both fear and curiosity. Pamphlets and newspapers speculated about causes, symptoms, and treatments. Some physicians argued that madness was not the result of sin, but of nervous exhaustion or hereditary weakness. Others pointed to overstimulation, political stress, or diet. This marked the beginning of what would later be called psychiatry. Though not fully formed, It represented a move away from moral or supernatural explanations. Institutions like Bethlehem Hospital in London, known as Bedlam, began to receive not only the poor, but also aristocrats and minor nobles. Royal families watched these developments, and some began to support reform. In France, Philippe Pinel advocated for more humane treatment, releasing patients from chains, and emphasizing observation and conversation. These ideas spread slowly into royal care, especially for princes and princesses, considered too delicate for court life, but not beyond hope of recovery. Some royal residences began to include rooms designated for mental rest, with padded furnishings, muted colors, and regulated schedules. Sleep became a key focus, as physicians noticed the role of fatigue and insomnia in worsening symptoms. Diet was adjusted to include calming foods, like milk, barley water and soft bread. Stimulation was reduced, loud music discouraged, and long readings avoided. Instead, gentle activities were prescribed: gardening, embroidery, reading scripture, short walks with attendants. These changes were subtle but meaningful. They reflected a growing awareness that mental health required care, not just punishment or restraint. Royal influence also helped legitimize mental illness as a field worth studying. The case of George III led to new approaches at Windsor, with detailed medical logs and structured treatment plans. These records were later studied by physicians and informed practices in broader society. In Austria, after Emperor Ferdinand's mental condition became public, Habsburg officials sought expert opinion, including input from foreign doctors, marking a shift from isolation to inquiry. The growing belief that mental illness could be managed, not just endured, helped reduce the stigma, at least among elites. This did not eliminate secrecy. Most cases remained closely guarded, but behind palace doors, attitudes were changing. Madness was no longer always divine punishment. It was increasingly seen as a medical condition, worthy of treatment, worthy of study, and monarchs, once feared for their instability, were now sometimes pitied or used as symbols to call for medical reform. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, posed challenges for monarchs, whose minds faltered. If reason was the basis of governance, then madness threatened more than just health, it threatened legitimacy. This made treatment more urgent, but also more political. Physicians who could restore clarity became valuable assets, not only as healers, but as protectors of dynastic order. As ideas spread across Europe, translated texts from England, France, and Germany found their way into royal libraries and into the hands of court doctors. New terms emerged: melancholia, neurosis, mania, providing labels that were medical rather than moral, and these terms began to appear in royal correspondence. Coded, cautious, but present nonetheless. The shift was gradual, but irreversible. By the early 19th century, the concept of the nervous illness was commonly used in royal courts, especially for female royals, whose symptoms did not fit older categories. Nervous conditions could be managed with rest, diet, and tranquility, and were less stigmatized than outright madness. This allowed some royals to re-enter public life after periods of retreat, though the language was still imprecise, and the treatments often rudimentary. The direction had changed, from punishment to protection, from isolation to observation. Royal families, once helpless before the mysteries of the mind, now had tools, however limited, to respond, and in doing so, they helped shape the early evolution of mental health treatment for all classes, not just the crown. In many royal families, the presence of mental illness or chronic physical conditions was closely linked to concerns about heredity and the future of the dynasty. If one monarch exhibited signs of madness, courtiers and advisors quickly turned their attention to their offspring. Were the children healthy? Were the grandchildren showing signs? Was the bloodline compromised? These questions carried enormous weight, especially in hereditary monarchies, where continuity of rule depended on a perception of strength and fitness. If illness was seen as inherited, it could undermine marriage prospects, treaty negotiations, and the political standing of a royal house. This led to intense scrutiny of royal children, both in public and in private. Babies were observed for developmental delays, for signs of seizures, for failure to speak, walk, or respond. If anything seemed unusual, nurses and physicians were instructed to keep quiet, or to report only to the highest-ranking family members. In some cases, a child showing signs of mental disturbance was removed from court entirely, raised in a remote estate, under the care of trusted attendants. The public might be told the child was sickly, or receiving special education, but the underlying motive was usually concealment. In Austria, the Habsburgs struggled with inherited conditions, linked to generations of consanguineous marriage. Children born with cognitive disabilities, or severe physical deformities, were often excluded from portraits, or never formally introduced at court. In Spain, King Carlos II suffered from profound developmental and reproductive issues, thought to be the result of inbreeding. By the end of his reign, the Habsburg line in Spain had no viable heirs, leading to the War of Spanish Succession. Such outcomes heightened anxiety across Europe about the mixing of royal bloodlines and the potential for inherited madness or fragility. Marriages between royal houses began to be evaluated, not only for political advantage, but for biological risk. Medical histories were quietly compiled, tracking which families had produced sound rulers, and which had not. This practice resembled early forms of eugenic thinking. Long before the term existed, some families were labeled dangerous, their daughters considered risky brides, their sons viewed with caution. In Russia, the Romanovs kept detailed genealogical charts, monitoring patterns of epilepsy, depression, or alcoholism within extended branches of the dynasty. In Britain, concerns about madness in the Hanover line led to careful vetting of potential matches to prevent recurrence in future monarchs. Despite this, the problem was not always preventable. Even with careful planning, mental illness could arise in unexpected forms or skip generations. When it did, the royal household reacted swiftly. If the afflicted individual held no official title, they might be quietly institutionalized and rarely spoken of again. If they were in line to rule, more complex arrangements were needed. Sometimes, a regency was prepared in advance, with trusted advisors briefed and documentation sealed, to be opened only in a crisis. If the individual's symptoms were mild, they might be trained to perform limited public duties, while real power was exercised elsewhere. In Prussia, Frederick William IV suffered from increasing mental instability, but was not officially removed. Instead, his brother William served as regent, and later assumed the throne. In some courts, efforts were made to normalize affected children through intense education, rigid discipline, or controlled public appearances. If they could perform basic ceremonial tasks, they might still serve a role as a symbolic presence, even if never entrusted with real authority. Art and portraiture were often manipulated to show such individuals in calm, dignified poses, even if they rarely behaved that way in private. Diaries of courtiers and servants sometimes revealed the truth, describing tantrums, silence, or confusion behind closed doors. These entries were rarely published and often destroyed by royal archivists, especially in the 19th century, when the idea of dynastic perfection became a critical element of national identity. The problem of hereditary illness also influenced decisions about abdication. If a monarch feared passing on a disorder, or saw its effects in their children, they might choose to step down, or alter the line of succession. In the Netherlands, Queen Wilhelmina considered such issues when grooming her daughter for the throne, monitoring her mental and emotional development with great care. In other cases, royals became deeply superstitious, blaming illness on family curses or sins of their ancestors. Such beliefs, while not medical, still shaped how illness was interpreted and how heirs were chosen or excluded. As genetics became more scientifically grounded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, royal families took a cautious interest. Some quietly consulted emerging experts, seeking reassurance or warning about the risk to future generations, but open discussion remained rare, because to admit hereditary illness was to admit weakness, and for monarchies built on permanence, such an admission was still too dangerous, so the cycle continued. Observation, secrecy, removal, and behind every royal portrait, a careful decision about what to show and what to hide. In the complex world of royal succession, the mental or physical health of a monarch could reshape the future of an entire nation. Illness, especially madness, posed a unique legal and constitutional challenge. What happened if a sovereign could no longer govern, but had not died? Different kingdoms answered this question differently, but the stakes were always high, because royal power was not designed to pause. In monarchies, where the sovereign ruled directly, such as England, France, or Russia, a ruler's incapacity created a vacuum that had to be filled carefully and quickly. One common solution was the creation of a regency. A designated figure, often a close relative, was empowered to act in the monarch's name without dethroning them. This model preserved legal continuity while removing actual control from the afflicted ruler. In Britain, the Regency Act of 1811 was enacted when King George III entered a prolonged state of mental incapacity. His son, the Prince of Wales, was appointed as Prince Regent and carried out royal duties for nearly a decade. Until the king's death in 1820, the law had been crafted with caution, designed to protect royal dignity while allowing government to continue. Such acts usually required parliamentary approval and the support of key ministers to avoid accusations of treason. In some cases, the sovereign recovered, making the legal balance delicate. To declare a ruler incapacitated too quickly or without evidence risked public backlash or internal revolt. The documentation had to be precise. Doctors' statements, witness reports, confidential testimony. The language used was intentionally vague. Phrases like temporary indisposition, inability to discharge the duties of state, or withdrawal from active governance, all avoided the word madness. In monarchies where succession was not strictly hereditary, the presence of illness could accelerate decisions. In the Holy Roman Empire, electors had the power to choose a new emperor, and health concerns often influenced their votes. When Charles V of Habsburg abdicated, citing both physical exhaustion and spiritual reasons, his decision was influenced by chronic gout and possible depression. His brother Ferdinand was prepared as successor long before the transition occurred. In France, succession was governed by Salic law, which prohibited female inheritance, but had no clear provisions for mental incapacity. This led to political chaos during the reign of Charles VI, whose repeated breakdowns left the kingdom vulnerable to internal division and external invasion. Rival factions, including the Duke of Burgundy and the House of Armagnac, claimed authority by acting in the king's name. The situation contributed to the ongoing 100 Years' War and undermined trust in royal leadership. Elsewhere, some monarchs were forced to abdicate when illness could no longer be hidden. In Spain, Queen Isabella II was removed from the throne amid growing concern over her erratic behavior. and political instability. Though her mental state was never formally diagnosed, it played a role in weakening her position and increasing pressure from reformist factions. In Russia, when Tsar Paul V became increasingly unstable, his erratic decrees and isolationist policies alarmed both nobility and military leaders. He was overthrown in a palace coup and replaced by his son Alexander I, though the transition was framed as necessary for national security. Sometimes, illness was used as a pretext, even when the sovereign remained functional. Political enemies might exaggerate symptoms to justify usurpation or to create a shadow government. This was especially common in courts where power was contested and clear legal frameworks were absent. The threat of illness, even before it became evident, could lead to changes in governance. In Denmark, King Christian VII was known for mental illness, possibly schizophrenia, but remained king in name for decades. Real power was exercised by others, first his physician Johann Struensee, then his son and regent, Frederick. This long regency blurred the line between monarchy and manipulation. In constitutional monarchies, as they developed, laws were gradually introduced to define procedures. The goal was to ensure that the transition of power could occur without revolution and without destroying the image of the crown itself. Succession crises shaped history in profound ways. A delayed regency could lead to war. A forced abdication could shatter royal prestige. A secret illness could paralyze governance, while rivals plotted in silence. And always, the illusion of control had to be preserved. Even when behind the scenes, the sovereign no longer ruled in mind or in will. These events reminded courts that monarchy was fragile, built on bodies and minds that could falter, and when they did, the laws of succession were tested, reshaped, and rewritten again and again to serve not just tradition, but survival. In the tightly controlled world of royal courts, truth was rarely spoken plainly, especially when it came to illness, and even more so when that illness involved the mind. Language became a shield, a tool for concealment, a way to acknowledge a crisis without naming it. Official records, letters, announcements to the public, all employed cautious, coded phrases. Instead of saying a monarch was mad, they were described as unwell, fatigued by the burden of office, in need of repose, or withdrawn for spiritual reflection. When symptoms were more severe, language shifted again to terms like a temporary disorder, a troubled spirit, or an alteration of natural disposition. These phrases could mean anything from mild melancholy to complete delusion, incapacity. The lack of clarity was not accidental. It served political purposes, keeping options open and avoiding panic. In internal communications between ministers and advisors, language remained cautious, but slightly more descriptive. A king might be said to display incoherence, episodes of irrationality, or no longer distinguishes day from night. But even then, outright terms like insane, mad, or lunatic were avoided, unless legal action was required. In court diaries, scribes often used euphemisms, or simply omitted troubling events. If the monarch screamed, attacked a servant, or wandered barefoot through the corridors, the record might simply note, "The king passed the day in quiet contemplation." For historians, this has made reconstruction difficult. Many cases of royal illness are understood only through indirect references or foreign accounts. Ambassadors from rival states sometimes provided clearer observations, but their letters were also political and might exaggerate or distort. They might write, "The Queen did not speak at council. The prince repeated his instructions for hours," or "the sovereign's eyes were fixed and distant." These clues suggest deeper problems, but are framed in the language of diplomacy. Even private letters between royal relatives were carefully worded. If a mother wrote to her daughter about the king's health, she might say, "His spirits are uneven." Yet the physicians remain hopeful. When royal patients died, obituaries rarely mentioned illness at all. They were described as passing, after a brief affliction, in Christian peace, or while in quiet reflection. Only in rare instances was mental illness acknowledged explicitly, and even then, only when the monarchy's survival required legal justification. When the British Parliament debated the Regency Act of 1811, it did so using carefully framed testimony that described George III's condition as a deviation from usual mental clarity, a state not compatible with royal duties. No mention was made of his rants, his confusion about time and space, or his inability to recognize his family. The avoidance of plain terms was not only about protecting the monarch, but about protecting the institution of monarchy itself. To speak openly about royal madness was to challenge the idea of divine rule and the continuity of sovereign judgment. This applied not only to monarchs, but also to consorts, heirs, and extended relatives. If a royal daughter showed signs of mental illness, her condition might be described as delicate, disposed to reflection, or sensitive to company. If a crown prince fell into depression, he might be burdened by responsibility, in retreat for education, or seeking strength in solitude. Servants and attendants were often warned never to speak of what they saw, never to use clinical words, and never to write personal notes. In some courts, strict penalties were imposed on anyone who discussed the health of a sovereign outside approved channels. This control extended to artists. Portraits were altered to remove signs of illness, sunken eyes corrected, expression brightened, posture adjusted. Even clothing was symbolic. A monarch shown in full robes, even while bedridden in reality, suggested continuity and command. Only in rare private archives did the truth sometimes surface. Marginal notes in doctors' journals, secret letters between siblings, confessions written in old age. These fragments reveal a different picture, a picture of fear, of confusion, and of careful, deliberate silence. Because in the end, language was power, and the choice not to say, not to name, not to admit, was a way to hold that power just a little longer. Even as the mind, behind the crown, slipped further away, beyond the reach of words, and into the silence that only careful phrases could ever hope to contain. The involvement of queens and royal consorts in managing the health of a reigning monarch was often quiet, but central. When a king or prince fell ill, especially with symptoms of madness, his wife or female relatives frequently became the first line of defense, and sometimes the last. Their roles were not formalized. There were no official titles, no legal recognition of their authority over health decisions. But in practice, they often supervised care, chose physicians, and mediated between the private sickroom and the public court. In many royal courts, the queen had her own network of attendants, ladies-in-waiting, personal chaplains, and household staff. This network allowed her to monitor the king without the interference of ministers. At least initially, when symptoms first appeared, the queen might attempt to shield her husband, managing his schedule, reducing public appearances, and controlling access to his chambers. This effort was not just personal loyalty, it was political strategy, meant to delay the moment when power had to be formally transferred. In France, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria played a central role during the long decline of Charles II. She managed factions, oversaw the upbringing of their children, and acted as a stabilizing force. Even as the kingdom drifted into civil war, her efforts were not always successful, but they reflected the weight placed on consorts to preserve royal authority, even when the sovereign could no longer speak coherently. In Britain, Queen Charlotte remained deeply involved. During King George III's periods of illness, she corresponded with doctors, attended some of his treatments, and relayed updates to the court. Her letters show worry, but also determination, to protect the king's dignity and maintain the appearance of routine. When political pressure mounted to declare a regency, Charlotte resisted, hoping for recovery and fearing the consequences of premature action. In Spain, when Philip V fell into deep depression, his second wife, Elizabeth Farnese, took over many court responsibilities. She guided policy, oversaw court appointments, and corresponded with foreign powers. Though not formally ruling, her presence kept the monarchy functioning and kept rivals at bay. Queens also acted as advocates. They defended the reputation of their husbands, and later, of their children. If a son or daughter showed signs of illness, the queen might attribute it to stress or to influence from unworthy tutors, rather than admit to a deeper issue. This protection sometimes backfired. Delays in treatment or refusal to accept symptoms could worsen the condition and complicate succession plans, but the alternative was often worse. Once ministers and courtiers took over, the family's influence could vanish, and the monarch could be fully isolated from those who cared most. Queens were also key in managing secrecy. They decided who was allowed in, which servants remained in the king's presence, and how information reached the public. Some personally oversaw household changes, altering room arrangements, limiting access to windows and doors, to ensure privacy and safety. In some courts, queens became the unofficial interpreters of the monarch's speech and behavior. When the king mumbled or gave strange orders, the queen would step in, rephrasing, clarifying, or quietly reversing his decisions. Their familiarity with the sovereign allowed them to detect early signs of relapse or fleeting moments of clarity that others might miss. These moments were valuable, used to time official actions, such as signing documents or making ceremonial appearances. In Russia, Empress Maria Feodorovna supported her son Alexander while shielding him from the consequences of his father Paul I's increasingly unpredictable rule. Behind palace walls, she coordinated efforts to protect both of them, until Paul was ultimately deposed. The role of queens in caregiving also extended to health rituals. They prepared herbal remedies, led prayers, and coordinated visits from priests and physicians. Their chambers sometimes became the center of recovery, more than the king's own suite, because queens were expected to provide not only heirs, but moral guidance. Their presence offered reassurance to courtiers and the public alike. Even in silence, their presence in ceremonies, beside a troubled or absent king, signaled continuity. This symbolic role helped stabilize regimes during uncertain transitions. In portraits, queens were often depicted with poise, a calm counterbalance to the volatility of the king. That image was carefully maintained. Even when behind the canvas, the burden was immense. The queen's work was rarely recorded, rarely rewarded, but through countless quiet decisions, controlled conversations, and private acts of care, she helped preserve not only her husband's image, but the survival of the monarchy itself. A steady hand behind the scenes in the long hidden history of royal illness and royal endurance. Court life was built on ceremony, rank, etiquette, and reputation. And few things threaten that structure more than whispers of illness, especially madness, in the royal family. The royal court was a living machine of gossip, a web of attendants, advisors, envoys, relatives, each watching, listening, speculating. When a monarch began to act strangely, word spread quickly, not through official channels, but through glances, silences, and carefully chosen phrases. A missing face at a banquet, a slurred speech during council, a refusal to attend mass. These became clues. Courtiers filled the gaps with their own interpretations, some out of concern, others for gain. Because if a king appeared unstable, the question of who would rule next became more than curiosity. It became opportunity. The court divided into factions. Those loyal to the monarch, those favoring a regent, and those with ambitions of their own. Rumors became weapons. A whispered report of the king talking to himself, of strange noises from the royal bedchamber, or of physicians summoned late at night, could trigger suspicion. Ambassadors listened closely. They wrote to their home governments, noting changes in routine, new faces in the king's circle, or the increased presence of guards. In the absence of official statements, these details shaped foreign policy. Should a treaty be signed now? Should marriage negotiations be delayed? Sometimes the rumors were false, or exaggerated, but sometimes they were accurate. And those who heard them first moved quickly to protect their interests. In France, when Charles VI began to suffer, his episodes, word of his behavior spread through the court before reaching the streets. His moments of clarity were brief, and between them, ministers and nobles argued, not only over governance, but over who had the right to speak for the king. In Britain, when George III's illness worsened, his absence from events raised questions. Newspapers hinted that he was unwell, but avoided specifics. Behind the scenes, members of parliament debated when and how to introduce a regency. Some feared acting too soon, others feared waiting too long. Within the palace, servants were silenced. Doctors were reminded to speak only to senior officials. But even with precautions, rumors leaked. Court artists noticed cancelled sittings. Dressmakers were told to delay fittings. Guards were rotated more frequently. Each change became part of the whisper network. When a monarch's condition was widely suspected, courtiers adjusted their behavior. Some withdrew from public view to avoid being associated with a fading regime. Others increased their presence, aligning with rising figures, perhaps a regent in waiting, or a powerful consort. The question of loyalty became fraught. To remain close to an ailing king was seen as honorable, but also potentially dangerous. If power shifted elsewhere, to abandon the monarch too soon was equally risky. If he recovered and remembered, this uncertainty created a court atmosphere of tension and performance. Every gesture, every word, carried potential consequence. Foreign envoys observed carefully and reported not just official acts, but moods, rumors, expressions. They noted who stood closest to the throne, who spoke for the king, who visited the royal apartments, and who stopped being invited. Some rumors were deliberately planted to weaken a rival or justify a change in governance. In extreme cases, medical reports were forged, witness statements rehearsed, and official announcements timed to coincide with political shifts. Such manipulation was dangerous, but effective, because in royal courts, perception shaped reality. If enough people believed the king was mad, even if he was not, his authority could vanish. And if enough people believed he had recovered, even if he had not, his name could still command obedience. Rumors filled the space between what was true and what could be proven. They traveled faster than proclamations and lingered longer than edicts. Even after a monarch died, stories about their condition persisted. They shaped the legacy of the reign and influenced how future generations remembered their rule. In this way, court gossip was not just idle talk. It was a political force, a channel of influence, and often a first warning sign of a crown in crisis, quietly trembling behind the curtain. In the centuries before modern medicine, one of the dominant systems used to understand illness in royal courts and beyond was astrology. Astrological medicine, sometimes called iatromathematics, combined knowledge of the stars and planets with theories of the human body. Royal physicians, especially in the medieval and early modern periods, consulted astronomical charts before diagnosing a patient or prescribing treatment. They believed that the positions of celestial bodies affected the balance of humors in the body. and influenced both physical and mental health. For monarchs, this was not mere superstition, it was considered advanced science, a blend of mathematics, theology, and observation. When a king showed signs of confusion or melancholy, his physician might check the alignment of Mars and Saturn, planets associated with blood, anger, and depression. If the moon was full, or in a certain house, it might be deemed unwise to administer a purge or perform a bleeding. Even the time of day and the monarch's birth sign could influence the chosen treatment. Birth charts were drawn for most royal children, not just to predict fortune, but to plan their health regimen and anticipate periods of vulnerability. In some courts, a separate royal astrologer was employed, distinct from the physician, tasked with interpreting omens, eclipses, conjunctions, and the horoscopes of foreign rivals. These charts were recorded and consulted regularly. Medical astrology classified each organ and each humor under a zodiac sign and a planet. For example, the brain was ruled by Mercury, the heart by the Sun, the liver by Jupiter, and the spleen by Saturn. If a royal suffered from sleeplessness or racing thoughts, the physician might say Mercury was disturbed, and would then recommend calming herbs. When the moon was in a favorable position, dates for surgeries, and even when to take medicine, were sometimes scheduled, based on the movement of the heavens. This system was not limited to Europe. In Persia, India, and the Islamic world, medical astrology was deeply integrated into royal healthcare systems. In Mughal India, astrologers advised emperors on the best days for travel, battle, and medicine, drawing on both Indian and Greek traditions. In the Abbasid Caliphate, scholars translated and expanded Greek astrological texts, preserving and refining methods used later by European courts. Even in Orthodox Russia, where astrology was sometimes viewed with suspicion, elite families kept private horoscopes and consulted stargazers in secret. During the Renaissance, astrology reached a new height of prestige. Figures like Paracelsus blended alchemical and astrological knowledge, arguing that celestial forces shaped both body and spirit. Royal patrons funded observatories, not just for navigation or calendar reform, but for medical insight. Astrology and astronomy were not yet divided, and star charts were viewed as legitimate tools for healing the sick. In times of crisis, astrologers were consulted alongside physicians. When a monarch was struck by sudden illness, questions were asked. Was this caused by planetary retrograde? Was there a solar eclipse that foretold madness? These questions were taken seriously, not only by courtiers, but often by the monarchs themselves. The stars offered a kind of order. When the mind was disordered, they provided explanations. In a world that lacked microscopes and brain scans, and they gave royal families a calendar of expectation, a cycle of health and risk that could be read, predicted, and managed. Skeptics existed, even then, but few in power ignored astrology completely, because it offered something more than diagnosis. It offered timing, a sense of when to act and when to wait. If the stars were unfavorable, a journey might be delayed, a public appearance postponed, a decision left unsigned, and if the stars aligned favorably, healing seemed more likely, not only in the body, but in the stability of rule. Over time, as scientific methods advanced, astrology lost its status in medicine. It was pushed aside, first by anatomy, then by chemistry, then by psychology. But in royal archives, charts remain, meticulously drawn, with symbols and angles, quiet echoes of a time when madness was not only observed in the mind, but read in the stars. In the royal courts of Europe and beyond, diagnosing illness was often imprecise, and the line between physical and mental suffering was blurred. Frequently, dangerously, a monarch who could not walk steadily might be said to be mad. A monarch who shouted nonsense might be suffering from fever or infection, but was treated as insane. This confusion was rooted in the limited medical knowledge of the time. Doctors did not yet understand the brain or the nervous system, and many conditions were interpreted through outward behavior alone. One of the most frequent errors was mistaking neurological illness for madness. A king who suffered from epilepsy might have seizures mistaken for demonic possession or mental instability. In other cases, monarchs afflicted by high fevers, malaria, or typhoid experienced hallucinations, delirium, and violent mood swings, rather than identifying the cause as infection. Physicians often declared the mind to be broken and prescribed purging, bleeding, or restraint. In the absence of internal diagnostics, symptoms were treated in isolation. Speech disorders, tremors, or confusion were addressed as if they were separate diseases, rather than linked to a single condition. Multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, encephalitis, none of these were known by name, and many sufferers were labeled with general terms, like melancholic disordered, or possessed. The result was often mistreatment. A monarch with chronic pain was thought to be irritable by nature, or morally weak. A sovereign with depression was seen as lazy, or cowardly, not as someone requiring rest or medicine. In some courts, even blindness or deafness was interpreted through psychological theories. If a child heir failed to speak, he might be labeled idiot, rather than understood as deaf. If a queen could no longer walk, she might be said to be withdrawn, rather than suffering from a spinal condition. Women in particular were vulnerable to misdiagnosis. Symptoms of anemia, hormone imbalance, or migraine were often declared to be hysteria, an imagined illness, or a failure of female temperament. Treatments were based on this misunderstanding. Isolation, sedatives, spiritual guidance, but not physical care. One of the most notable examples was King George III. His erratic speech, periods of restlessness and depression, and discolored urine have led modern scholars to suggest he may have suffered from porphyria, a metabolic disorder, not a mental one. Yet during his life, he was treated as mentally unstable, restrained, secluded, and publicly declared mad. His treatment included leeching, isolation, and the denial of basic comforts, based on the belief that stimulation worsened his mental storm. Other monarchs likely experienced strokes or traumatic brain injuries from falls, duels, or military service. Their resulting aphasia, confusion, or paralysis were often interpreted as divine punishment or irreversible madness. In France, royal physicians sometimes misread signs of poisoning as signs of psychological decline. A poisoned king might first appear forgetful, then hallucinate, then become unresponsive. But rather than investigate toxins, doctors would recommend purging and turn to astrology or prayer. This conflation of causes meant that many royal deaths were misunderstood at the time and only reinterpreted later. Through modern medical review, the reverse also occurred. Real madness was sometimes mistaken for physical ailment. A monarch might complain of headaches, palpitations, or fatigue, but actually be suffering from paranoia, hallucinations, or manic episodes. Because symptoms were described, not explained, there was little consistency and no clear diagnostic path. This had consequences for governance. Ministers might underestimate the severity of illness or overreact, replacing a king too early or not soon enough. The ambiguity served some and harmed others. It allowed families to hide the truth, but also denied rulers the chance for proper care. Only in the 19th and 20th centuries, with the rise of neurology and psychiatry, did physicians begin to sort physical brain disease from mental illness. from temporary delirium. Until then, the confusion was nearly universal, and the royal body remained a mystery, studied through the lens of temperament, moral balance, planetary influence, and faith. And so, for centuries, madness and sickness were not separate, but interchangeable, two shadows cast over the throne by symptoms no one yet understood, and treatments no one could yet get right. When illness appeared in royal children, especially signs of mental delay or instability, the response from monarchies was swift and often secretive. Children were watched closely from the moment of birth for signs of health, strength, and normal development. Any deviation, a delay in speech, lack of eye contact, unusual behavior, was a source of alarm, because royal children were not just family members, they were heirs, symbols of continuity, and tools of diplomacy. If a child could not be trusted to rule, the future of a dynasty was immediately in question. In early infancy, abnormal signs were often explained away as a passing phase, late bloomers, or delicate in constitution. But as the child aged and issues persisted, action was taken. In some courts, special tutors were assigned not to teach, but to observe and report to the queen or senior courtiers. Reports were coded, phrases like "of quiet demeanor, needs additional repetition, responds best to gentle correction," were understood to mean developmental or cognitive challenges. In Austria, members of the Habsburg family, known for their long tradition of intermarriage, produced several children with visible disabilities. One of the most famous was Archduchess Maria Anna, sister to Maria Theresa, who was born with a pronounced head deformity and reportedly limited speech. She was never presented at court, lived in a convent, and was excluded from official family records. In Spain, the child of a noble family showing signs of epilepsy or repeated tantrums might be moved to a country estate, cared for by nuns or private attendants, and publicly said to be in education or prayer. Such arrangements allowed the family to preserve appearances while preventing rumors from reaching rival courts or foreign ambassadors. In Britain, Prince Octavius, the eighth son of King George, died in childhood, and though historical records describe him as sweet and lively, some private letters hint at odd behavior that worried the king and queen. Had he lived, he may have faced the same scrutiny, given the family's history of mental instability. When illness appeared in teenage heirs, the stakes were even higher. An adult prince, who could not speak publicly, hold a sword, or manage letters of state, was a direct liability. These princes were sometimes married off early to strong-willed spouses, hoped to compensate for their condition. Others were quietly removed from the line of succession, with little explanation. In Prussia, a young prince with cognitive disability was named a military inspector, given a uniform, but never given command. He attended ceremonies, smiled when prompted, but signed no orders. This created the illusion of inclusion, without handing over real authority. For royal daughters, the situation was different. They were not expected to rule directly, but were still key to alliances. If a princess was judged unfit for marriage, due to her mind or demeanor, she might be placed in a religious house, given honorary titles, and quietly removed from political life. In Russia, some daughters of the imperial family were kept in the Winter Palace, but never shown to visitors. In portraits, only the publicly accepted siblings appeared, with no visual record of those in seclusion. Occasionally, a royal child with illness would be the subject of prayer campaigns, calls for intercession by saints, or healing visits to shrines. If improvement followed, it was seen as divine favor. If not, the family moved on, without public explanation. In some cases, siblings or cousins were elevated instead, declared to be stronger, more capable, and therefore more fit to rule. The afflicted child was rarely seen again. Doctors were involved, but offered little clarity. They might diagnose nervous weakness, melancholic constitution, or limited comprehension, without offering any treatment. Their role was more political than medical, to provide words that justified removal from succession, without shaming the dynasty. Throughout history, these children were hidden, but not forgotten. Letters between queens and mothers often express sorrow, concern, and helplessness, but the reality of monarchy required action. For the line to continue, for the realm to remain stable, any threat to the crown's future had to be contained. And so, a quiet system of management emerged. Observation, reassignment, seclusion. Royal children with illness became part of a separate track. Cared for, but never crowned. Loved, but never shown. A hidden branch of every royal family tree growing quietly, out of view, but always present in the shadows of the throne. The Enlightenment, spanning the 17th and 18th centuries, ushered in profound changes in how illness, including madness, was understood, discussed, and treated. This intellectual movement focused on reason, science, and empirical observation, challenged the older frameworks of divine punishment, astrological alignment, and humoral imbalance. And royal families, situated at the intersection of tradition and innovation, began slowly to incorporate these new ideas into their private health practices. Not all at once, and not evenly across regions, but the shift was real and measurable. Before the Enlightenment, madness in the monarchy was largely handled with secrecy, spiritual intervention, or confinement. But now, new medical philosophies emerged, rooted in anatomy, chemistry, and the observation of behavior over time. These changes did not eliminate older ideas, but they began to add alternatives. Royal physicians, especially those trained in Paris, Edinburgh, Leiden or Vienna, began to write in new ways. Their notes included not just symptoms, but timelines, diet, sleep, patterns, and social behavior. They no longer relied solely on humors or planetary motion. They looked to nerves, to the brain, to physical causes. Nervous disorders became a common label, describing symptoms like melancholy, tremors, anxiety, and confusion. Royal patients, once described simply as mad or weak, were now said to suffer from nervous excitability, moral imbalances, or constitutional sensitivity. This language was still vague, but it marked a move toward medicalization, away from sin and shame, and toward explanation. King George III's illness came during this transitional period, and was treated by physicians familiar with both old and new theories. His care included isolation and purging, but also involved detailed documentation, regular check-ins, and efforts to maintain mental stimulation. The king's condition sparked public interest and parliamentary debate. Newspapers reported cautiously, but pamphlets circulated widely, discussing his symptoms and quoting medical theories. This public discourse reflected an Enlightenment-era belief that the human mind could be studied like any other organ. In France, doctors like Philippe Pinel advocated for more humane treatment of the mentally ill, arguing against chains and for observation, conversation, and structured care. His ideas were inspired by Enlightenment values, liberty, dignity, rationality, and while not applied directly to royal patients, they influenced broader court practices. Royal families began to see madness as something that could happen to anyone, noble or common, and potentially treated with care. not fear. Medical texts were now written in French or Latin, circulated among courts and universities, and sometimes translated into English, German or Russian. Queens and consorts, known for their interest in science and learning, encouraged their physicians to adopt these newer approaches. In Austria, the Empress Maria Theresa funded medical schools and supported vaccination campaigns, showing an increasing trust in rational medicine. Her son, Emperor Joseph II, introduced reforms to asylums, replacing dungeons with wards, and emphasizing recovery over confinement. In the German states, princes established sanatoriums, where noble families could send relatives for rest and treatment, without the social stigma of madness. These institutions, modeled on Enlightenment values, promised observation, documentation, and gentle care. Though limited by today's standards, they marked a departure from previous eras, where illness meant permanent exile. Royal advisors, influenced by Enlightenment writings, began to speak more openly about health and inheritance. They considered whether a ruler's condition was temporary or permanent, and whether it impaired reason. Reason became the new standard, not divine favor, not lineage. A sovereign who could not reason was increasingly seen as incapable of ruling. This led to more formal regency arrangements, based on legal and medical criteria. Reports were submitted, testimonies recorded, and physicians summoned to explain a monarch's state in rational, empirical terms. In some cases, this allowed for smoother transitions, without the drama of coup or revolt. In others, it introduced new tensions between old loyalties and new principles, because Enlightenment thinking, while expanding medical understanding, also questioned monarchy itself. If reason was universal, why should kings inherit power, regardless of mental fitness? Some monarchs recognized this threat, and worked to appear not only regal, but rational. They sponsored universities, attended scientific demonstrations, and posed with microscopes. Portraits from the late 1700s often depict kings as learned men, surrounded by books, instruments, and advisors, a direct contrast to earlier depictions of divine right and martial glory. This was not just symbolism, it was a defense against a world shifting toward merit and reason. For royal patients suffering mental illness, this shift meant more documentation, more careful observation, and in some cases, a gentler approach, but it also meant more pressure to conform, to recover, to demonstrate sound judgment, in public and in court, because in the age of Enlightenment, reason was not just a virtue, it was a requirement. And any monarch who failed to meet it risked losing not just power, but the very foundation of their right to rule. A quiet revolution, not of rebellion, but of thought, reshaping how madness was seen and how monarchs were allowed to fall ill in an age that prized the mind above all. As understandings of illness and care evolved across Europe, royal families began to extend their influence beyond palace walls by founding and supporting hospitals, asylums, and medical institutions. This royal patronage was not merely charitable. It served a dual function, easing public suffering while reinforcing royal legitimacy. Monarchs, by building or funding medical facilities, demonstrated their concern for the health of the people, and positioned themselves as protectors of both body and soul. In return, these institutions often bore royal names and displayed royal emblems, signaling the crown's presence in every corner of public life. One of the oldest royal hospitals in Europe was the Hôtel Dieu de Paris, founded in the 7th century and supported by successive French monarchs. It provided care for the sick and poor, while also training physicians and nuns in the healing arts. By the 17th and 18th centuries, royal support for hospitals expanded, especially as urban populations grew and outbreaks of disease threatened order. In Britain, Queen Anne supported the founding of hospitals for wounded soldiers and sailors, and King George II gave royal charters to several London institutions, including the Royal London Hospital and the Bethlehem Royal Hospital. Bethlehem, also known as Bedlam, was one of the earliest institutions in Europe dedicated to the care of the mentally ill. Though its conditions were often poor, its royal designation provided funding and ensured a steady stream of physicians interested in nervous and psychological disorders. Royal patronage also helped remove some of the stigma attached to mental illness. If the crown supported treatment, then madness could be seen not as criminal or shameful, but as a medical condition worthy of compassion. This influence was evident across other regions as well. In Russia, the Romanovs funded hospitals in Moscow and St. Petersburg, including institutions that cared for wounded veterans, foundlings, and the mentally ill. Tsar Alexander V supported the creation of civilian hospitals and encouraged the education of doctors trained in modern techniques, inspired by German and French models. In Austria, the Habsburgs established several major institutions, including the Allgemeines Krankenhaus in Vienna, a general hospital that became a center for research, treatment, and training. Emperor Joseph VI, deeply influenced by Enlightenment ideals, ordered that hospitals be open to all citizens and that care be based on need rather than social rank. This policy reflected a shift from charity to public health and from divine healing to medical science. Royal women played a key role as well. Queens and princesses often served as patrons of specific wards, especially those for women and children. They visited hospitals, provided funding for supplies, and helped design programs for moral instruction, alongside physical healing. Their presence added gentleness and legitimacy to institutions that were often feared or misunderstood. In many countries, asylums were built with royal backing, meant to offer structured, humane treatment rather than simple confinement. While early conditions remained harsh, royal involvement gradually led to reforms. New architecture was introduced, with separate wings for different conditions, access to light and fresh air, and spaces for work, prayer, rest. In Prussia, King Frederick William III supported the construction of specialized mental health facilities. Based on new theories of moral therapy, doctors were encouraged to observe, to document patient behavior, and to develop individualized treatment plans. These models influenced asylums across Europe and laid the foundation for modern psychiatric care. Royal patronage also supported education. Medical schools, sponsored by the crown, trained the next generation of physicians. Royal scholarships allowed students from middle-class families to study medicine and bring new ideas into court circles. Dissections, lectures, clinical rotations, all became part of medical education within institutions bearing royal seals. In some cases, monarchs even allowed their own illnesses to be used as case studies, advancing knowledge and reducing stigma. George III's treatment was studied by physicians across Europe and helped generate public interest in the science of the mind. The publication of medical notes and public debates about his regency brought mental illness into political discourse in ways previously unseen. This fusion of monarchy and medicine made health a matter of state, not only for kings and queens, but for their subjects as well. As royal courts expanded their medical reach, they shaped how societies viewed illness, who deserved care, and what counted as treatment. Hospitals bearing royal charters became places not only of healing, but of national pride, reflecting the values and aspirations of their founding sovereigns. Even today, many hospitals, medical colleges, and mental health institutions still carry royal titles, a quiet legacy of centuries of patronage, proof that the crown was not only a symbol of rule, but, at times, a sponsor of relief, in a world where sickness and madness touched even the highest seats of power, and where healing became part of the throne's enduring purpose. The language used in royal documents was always deliberate, crafted to obscure as much as it revealed, especially when it came to illness, and most especially, mental illness. For centuries, court records, proclamations, and correspondence avoided direct reference to madness, choosing instead a vocabulary of subtlety, discretion, and coded terms. This linguistic caution was not merely stylistic, it served political necessity, shielding the monarch, preserving the dynasty, and maintaining the illusion of unbroken control. When a king could no longer rule effectively, the record might state he was in retreat, taking rest upon medical advice, or absent, due to temporary indisposition. Such phrases were broad enough to cover fever, melancholy, paranoia, or total psychological collapse. The point was not to explain, but to delay, to protect, and to manage transitions, without naming the condition that prompted them. In official dispatches, the term distemper was common, vague, clinical, non-threatening. A royal suffering from delusions might be described as having fallen into a nervous crisis, or suffering an alteration of character. If the sovereign shouted incoherently, or refused to dress, court scribes might simply record that he withdrew from audiences, or received no company this day. Language acted as a buffer between reality and what the public and foreign powers were allowed to perceive. In diplomatic reports, particularly those exchanged with ambassadors, care was taken not to alarm allies or embolden rivals. Descriptions such as "the king is at ease, but quiet," or "Her Majesty continues her devotions in solitude," hinted at deeper troubles, without confirming them. The effect was a kind of managed opacity, where the truth was visible, but not stated, acknowledged, but not defined. Even in legal documents, such as regency declarations or letters patent, language remained neutral. The monarch might be declared unable to attend to affairs of state, or temporarily relieved of daily responsibilities, but the word insane was almost never used. In the Regency Act of 1811, which transferred power from George III to his son, the text avoided labeling the king as mad, instead referring to his continuing indisposition and inability to perform the functions of the crown. This kind of phrasing allowed the monarchy to remain intact in form, even when it had fractured in function. For historians, this creates challenges. Royal archives are filled with such euphemisms, making it difficult to trace the precise nature or progression of illness. Terms like vapors, nervous agitation, melancholic symptoms appear frequently, especially in the records of royal women. These expressions might suggest depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, or early signs of dementia. But without clinical context, certainty is elusive. Even within families, letters use soft language. A queen writing to her sister might say the king has been most withdrawn this week, or spoke at length on curious subjects. When speaking of heirs or children, courtiers were even more guarded. A prince who could not sit still was lively and spirited. A princess who could not learn to read was more inclined to music and contemplation. Private diaries, kept by nobles or attending staff, sometimes broke through this veil. Entries might note fits, unusual laughter, or conversations with no one present, but these accounts were rarely official, and often hidden from public view. Language was also shaped by law. In many monarchies, to declare a ruler insane, without legal proof, was an act of sedition. Thus courtiers chose words that signaled concern, without inviting prosecution. This led to an elaborate vocabulary, built to say everything, without saying anything clearly. In portraits, inscriptions might refer to strength of spirit, or quiet reign, code for a sovereign, who was present in name only. In funeral sermons, a monarch who died after years of madness was described as having borne his trials with divine patience, or having retired early from worldly cares. Even public statements, made by ministers or regents, use similar constructions. The king continues in his occlusion. Under the best care, the queen consults with her advisors during His Majesty's reflection. These phrases placated the people, without opening the court to scrutiny. Language in this context was power, not just over perception, but over policy. The ability to control how illness was described, determined how it was handled, whether succession was triggered, whether power was transferred, and whether a dynasty could survive. And so, for centuries, madness in royalty was not just a private matter, it was a linguistic matter, a field of carefully managed words, where meaning was wrapped in decorum, and truth was always one step behind the sentence. A monarch could lose his mind, but as long as the language remained intact, so did the crown. At least, on paper, at least, for now. Within the royal household, the presence of illness or instability in the sovereign often created a vacuum, where power shifted from public ministers to private companions. And at the center of this shift stood the queen, the consort, the spouse, whose role was both intimate and political. Queens were expected to stand beside their husbands, in health and in rule. But when illness struck, especially illness of the mind, their role expanded into that of caregiver, gatekeeper and protector. They were not physicians, nor formally trained in governance. Yet in practice, they shaped the daily life of an ailing monarch, more than any doctor or advisor ever could. The queen's first responsibility was often emotional and domestic. She ensured that routines were kept, that the sovereign was fed, bathed, clothed, and, if possible, reassured. She managed the staff, selecting those who were discreet, loyal, and unlikely to speak out. She coordinated visits from doctors, oversaw the use of sedatives or herbal remedies, and determined which guests, if any, might still be received. These duties were private, but the implications were political, because the queen controlled access to the monarch's body and to his signature. In monarchies, where rule depended on the seal, the voice, or the hand of the sovereign, control over that hand meant control over policy, and in moments of weakness, that power was everything. Some queens used it to stabilize the court, others used it to protect their children's futures, or to shield themselves from rival factions. In Spain, when King Philip II sank into depression, his wife, Elizabeth Farnese, assumed control of court business. She appointed ministers, directed correspondence, and preserved the dynasty's continuity. Philip's illness lasted years, and during that time, Elizabeth acted as the true ruler, though never crowned, never acknowledged formally, but always obeyed. In Britain, Queen Charlotte played a similar role. During the long decline of George V, she consulted with physicians, managed the royal household, and relayed updates to ministers. Her letters revealed deep concern, but also strategic thinking, weighing the risk of public disclosure against the need for a regency. Her authority grew, not through decree, but through presence in the room, at the bedside, in the silence between decisions. In France, Queen Marie Leszczyńska supported her husband Louis during periods of melancholy and withdrawal. Her influence was subtle, but her stability reassured the court, even when the king could not. Queens also shielded their husbands from public embarrassment. They corrected misstatements, explained away forgotten names, or smoothed over erratic behavior. With a laugh, a touch, a polite redirection. In council meetings, they might speak softly to the king, reminding him of details, or offering simple choices. These acts, though domestic in form, were political in function. They protected the sovereign's image and postponed the loss of power. When illness became severe and the monarch could no longer function, the queen's influence often grew. She became the informal liaison between the crown and the court, between the private sickroom and the machinery of government. Yet her position was fragile. She held no legal authority, and her influence depended on the trust of ministers and the favor of the people. If her decisions were seen as intrusive or self-serving, she risked being accused of manipulation. If she appeared too passive, she risked abandonment by both the court and history. Many queens walked this line, balancing duty, love, and power in times of extreme uncertainty. Their letters, diaries, and household records offer glimpses into these burdens, notes about the king's restlessness, about changes in behavior, about who visited and who was turned away. These records, though often dry in tone, reveal the daily labor of maintaining order within a royal life unraveling. Some queens leaned on faith, organizing prayers, lighting candles, inviting priests or monks to pray for recovery. Others turned to science, engaging foreign doctors, or seeking out new treatments in hopes of a cure. In some cases, they prepared for the worst. They briefed their children, consulted regency laws, and coordinated with allies to ensure that, when the time came, succession would be smooth. This foresight, though rarely praised, was essential, because while a king's illness was tragic, a crisis of succession was dangerous, and in the absence of a clear line of power, the queen's judgment was often the only thing holding the realm together. She was expected to be invisible, yet decisive, supportive, but not dominant, devoted yet unshaken. Her role was to preserve the monarchy's dignity, even as the monarch lost his hold on reality. This quiet stewardship has left little trace in monuments or in the names of laws, but behind every reign touched by madness, there is often a queen at the threshold between collapse and continuity, holding the center until power could be passed or peace restored. Across the royal courts of Europe and beyond, the way illness and madness were handled varied not only by time, but by geography, culture, and tradition. Each region, shaped by its own history, religion, and social norms, responded differently to mental instability in the ruling family. In Britain, where Protestantism and constitutional monarchy evolved together, madness in the sovereign was handled through legal procedure, particularly the introduction of formal regency acts. When George III became incapacitated, his power was not removed, but suspended, with governance transferred to his son as Prince Regent. This legal mechanism preserved royal dignity while allowing parliamentary rule to continue. It reflected a cultural preference for stability through law and for managing crisis without open confession of failure. In contrast, France under the Bourbon monarchy maintained a more centralized and absolutist structure. Mental illness in the king was politically catastrophic because the monarch embodied the state. When Charles VI descended into psychosis, believing he was made of glass, or forgetting who he was, the kingdom fractured. Rival factions, the Armagnacs and Burgundians, competed for control. Each claimed to act in the king's name, but in truth, power had slipped beyond the crown. French culture at the time still associated madness with divine signs or curses, and the king's condition became part of a broader mystical narrative. In Spain, a strong Catholic identity and the tradition of Habsburg rule framed illness more explicitly as spiritual punishment or inherited weakness. King Carlos II of Spain suffered from severe physical and cognitive disabilities, believed to be the result of generations of intermarriage. His condition was not only medical, but symbolic. It was seen as the collapse of a once mighty bloodline. The Spanish court responded, not with reform, but with ritual, calling for masses, processions, and religious penance. His death, without an heir, triggered the War of Spanish Succession, underscoring how illness could destabilize international politics. In the Holy Roman Empire, with its decentralized structure, illness in an emperor did not lead to immediate crisis. Regional princes held power and could maintain order locally, even as the imperial court adjusted. When Charles V abdicated, due in part to physical exhaustion and possible depression, he chose to divide his realm between his son in Spain and his brother in Austria. This act reflected both personal fatigue and an imperial culture that allowed for shared rule and succession flexibility. In Russia, the Tsars were autocrats, and illness in the ruler was treated as a threat to the divine order. Mental instability was often addressed through force or through rapid succession, as seen in the case of Tsar Paul I, whose erratic rule led to his assassination and replacement by his son, Alexander the Russian culture at the time combined orthodox spirituality with fear of disorder. Any sign of weakness in the Tsar could lead to plots, not legal regency. The court responded through removal, rather than management. In the Islamic world, such as the Ottoman Empire, responses to royal madness were shaped by palace, protocol, and dynastic control mechanisms. Sultans were guarded by a complex inner court, and if a ruler became incapacitated, he might be quietly deposed by powerful viziers and replaced by a brother or nephew. The political structure allowed for quick succession without needing to explain illness publicly. Mental illness was seen as a personal failing, but not always as a moral flaw. In some cases, it was treated with seclusion, in the comfort of palace gardens or distant wings. In China, imperial illness, including mental disturbance, was approached through traditional medicine, combined with Confucian ideas of harmony and order. The emperor's health was considered a mirror of the state. If he fell ill, rituals were performed, including fasting, offerings, and celestial observation. Doctors of the imperial court used acupuncture, herbal treatments, and breathing exercises to restore inner balance. The response was more medical than punitive, but always secretive. The emperor's condition was rarely disclosed, and often hidden, even from senior officials. In Japan, the emperor held symbolic power, with real rule often managed by shoguns, so illness, mental or physical, did not usually cause political upheaval. The imperial court responded with ceremony, not crisis, and the cultural emphasis on social harmony meant that even severe conditions were interpreted with gentleness.